When we held our World War III event last year, Frank arrived, looked around and said, "No Sam Faddis? How did you mess this one up?" And so luckily I have an opportunity to rectify that egregious oversight. And he was among the very first I reached out to. "Please come to Atlanta. We must have you." And I've been watching him on, again, the webinars. He brings such a just exceptional insight into what's going on. Again, his bio is in the program. Please join me in welcoming Sam Faddis.
Thank you very much for having me. I've destroyed the microphone already. The first thing I learned this morning is I guess I haven't been nice to Frank because he didn't give me a copy of his book, so I got to kiss up more. I don't know what. Those of you that have heard me speak before have heard me give what I call my disclaimer before I start talking. This is like a warning label. I was in the CIA for a long time, and CIA operates on written record traffic. I mean, they got radios and satellites and stuff, but they send, their official communications go back and forth, obviously electronically, written messages, and they're called cables. So to get anything officially done, you either send or receive a cable. It's a reference to the old days of literally cables and telegraphs and so forth. And there's this weird dialect that is very unofficially referred to as cableese. So all these messages are really overly polite. If you think of some English gentlemen in a men's club in the late 1800s in London, where everything's kind of stuffy and understated and indirect, a lot of quites and all of this kind of very overly polite, restrained method of speech. So my disclaimer is that I was always bad at that. So somewhere in the bowels of the giant computer databases at headquarters, I have no idea how many hundreds of messages there are from headquarters back to me in the field that begin, "Thank you for your candor." So you will understand that in cableese, that's not what that means. That means, "Faddis, you're a rude SOB, aren't you?" Like, okay, it is not my intention to be rude to you by any stretch of the imagination. It is my intention to be clear, though, as it always was, with this strange idea that in the world of intelligence, maybe we ought to clearly state what the hell is going on. Intelligence is not supposed to be about telling us, analyzing what already happened. I mean, that is done. But the purpose of intelligence really is to warn us of what has not happened yet. So we don't really rely on CIA to say, these are the guys who took down the World Trade Center and the Pentagon yesterday. We really want CIA and company to tell us they're going to try to take down the World Trade Center tomorrow, and this is how we stop it, which is sort of the point of this entire presentation and everything we do with Committee Present Danger China and so forth, is to say, you need to wake up and you need to be aware and you need to take action as a consequence, not just think about it, fret about it, but do something about it so it doesn't happen. So the World Trade Center doesn't come down ever and those people don't die. So I'm going to zero in for a moment talking about what I think is an example, as Frank said, what I refer to, using a technical term, as a clue of why we ought to be seized with the threat from the Chinese Communist Party, not just in a abstract, these guys want to supplant us eventually as the dominant power on the planet kind of way, but in a way like this is happening right now in really immediate ways. And I think a perfect example of that is Volt Typhoon. I don't know if that name is familiar to you. Volt Typhoon is a code name, if you will, a name given by the U.S. government to a wide-ranging Chinese cyber operation. And it There are a number of other code names that have been applied to this effort over a period of years, actually, but I'm just going to stick for the sake of simplicity with Volt Typhoon. So what is Volt Typhoon? I think last month, FBI Director Wray made a big presentation, which got actually a lot of press play, talking explicitly about Volt Typhoon and this wide-ranging Chinese cyber operations. The first thing to understand is I'm not the greatest fan of FBI Director Wray, but FBI Director Wray has actually made, well, I think in general he's conducting what we would call euphemistically a CYA tour in D.C. So he is with some regularity stating to the press things so that when it happens, don't blame me, I warned you. This is not the first time he's talked about Volt Typhoon, and he's not the only person in the federal government talking extensively about Volt Typhoon. And the federal government is not alone in talking about Volt Typhoon. All sorts of cybersecurity companies and folks that are respected in the industry have been beating this drum for some time. So for once, my first point is, for once, this doesn't really seem to be a case of there's a lot of disagreement or confusion or multiple points of view. Basically, everybody is beating the same drum, and they're saying, hey, this wide-ranging cyber operation by the Chinese is a really, really, really big deal, over and over and over. Unanimity on this issue. Okay, what is it? First, and I'm not a technical guy, on a good day I can find the power button on my laptop, but these are persistent attacks. So this is not denial of service. They're not pinging a website and knocking down a website to take it offline. Persistent attacks. They go inside computer systems and they stay inside the computer systems. So in the case of Volt Typhoon, at least 5 years. The real answer is we don't know, because we haven't detected them and we're not sure that we know every place they've been, so therefore we are still guessing. But they are persistent attacks. They are attacks where you go in and you don't just gain access, you gain access and then you expand your access. And the purpose ultimately is to acquire admin, super admin control over the system. So you are not just in a computer system, you own the computer system. And one of the techniques they use is what they call living off the land techniques, which means as the computer systems talk to each other, update, query each other, they piggyback on all this normal activity very patiently, obviously for the purpose of remaining undetected. And they gradually spread until, again, you own the system. Okay. Why? The systems that Ray is talking about and everybody else is talking about are computer systems associated with American critical infrastructure. This is the electrical power grid. We're talking the water systems, anything that are the basic backbone of modern American life. Not about stealing credit card numbers, not about stealing personal data. This has nothing to do with that. And it's not simply they're mapping them, we're sucking out information. I mean, in the course of what they're doing, they're obviously sucking up information. But with the explicit purpose, and everybody says this who's studying it, of being able to take down and destroy those systems. So you're into the water systems that supply water to New York City, and that's only an example, with the purpose of destroying that system and keeping it down. This is the other critical element. This is not the power's going to go off and you're going to hang out and light some candles for a couple of hours and the power is going to come back on. And it's not necessarily just rebooting the system, because there are ways here to cause physical damage. So you're talking about taking down systems and keeping the systems down. And this is well advanced. In fact, Ray at one point in his discussions said, if you took everybody that the Chinese have just on cyber and every person we have working cyber against every target on the planet. The number of Chinese attacking us and the resources we have to counter every cyber resource on every threat on the planet, not just the Chinese, they outnumber us 50 to 1. So we're flat on our backsides. They are eating our lunch. I mean, whatever other euphemism you want to use, they are penetrating the systems, not hoping to penetrate the systems, not thinking about it, not lying around having deep thoughts about it. They have done it. They are there. Now, that's not the bad news yet, as depressing as all that is. The really bad part is that Ray has said very, very explicitly, and everybody agrees on this, this is clearly not with the intention of one of these days being able to knock out these systems. This is a near-term threat. In fact, he has explicitly said, by at the latest 2027. So they're not working on the idea that 50 years from now or 10 years from now, maybe they would have this capacity. They are preparing in the near term, and he has also said this very explicitly, to launch this in conjunction with some sort of confrontation with the United States of America. And he has explicitly said, including a military confrontation. So you boil out that bureaucratic mumbo jumbo as clearly as he possibly could say, they're getting ready to stage a cyber attack, crush our critical infrastructure. Now, I want you to think a couple of other points. First of all, there's no reason to think that this occurs in isolation. But first, to highlight once again emphasize the impact of this. The federal government has conducted experiments. In fact, there was a project called Project Aurora a number of years ago where they demonstrated conclusively that by these kind of cyber attacks, you wouldn't just take down the computer systems, you could destroy the physical infrastructure. You can probably still find this on YouTube. There's actually video of a very large generator unit, like from a power plant, and I think they did this out at the Idaho National Lab, and they're videoing it while they are sending signals via the cyber connection, the computer system, conflicting signals, and you can watch the thing start to vibrate and then ultimately belch black smoke and catch fire. Nobody's in the room with it. That's all done remotely because it is connected to the internet, I mean, for certain purposes, and they've hacked into the systems. So you're not talking about just switching something off and then ultimately switching it back on. You're potentially talking about the physical plant is destroyed. Also, obviously, we know this is not occurring in isolation, as if the Chinese aren't doing anything else. So one of the things that Frank and I have talked about a lot is these very large transformers that are the backbone of our power grid. A lot of concern about what they virtually all come from China now. Of course, we stopped building them. They take years to arrive. You don't buy one at Walmart. You pre-order it, and it takes 3 years to show up, and they weigh hundreds of tons. Obviously, we could assume in a conflict with China, the Chinese are not sending us anymore. A lot of concern about what the Chinese are building into those things. Back under the Trump administration, one of them that came in, I think, to the port of New Orleans was seized, trucked out to Sandia Labs, where they disassembled this thing. The results of what they found remain classified, so I'm not going to talk about that. But I can tell you that immediately following that, President Trump issued an emergency order forbidding the installation of any further Chinese very large transformers in our power grid. So I think we could surmise that what Sandia found was not good, to use a technical term. The first day, I don't know how he managed to do all these things, all these bad things on the first day he sat down, but Joe Biden did in fact find time on the first day he was in the Oval Office to rescind that executive order so we could go back to installing things. So what I'm saying is, as they're crashing remotely the internet via what we're talking about, Volt Typhoon, one presumes they are also causing all of these very large transformers that we cannot replace to die, physically die. So just take a moment. Anybody who's ever either lived through a blackout in a major metropolitan area or watched video of it, and imagine that you're in New York City and there's no more water and there's no more power, and what we're talking about. What we're talking about is taking the United States back to a completely pre-electrification, pre-industrial state. One day you're in the 21st century, the next moment you're in the 16th century, except it's a lot worse because you don't have a farm out back and you don't have the capacity to raise your own livestock, and you don't have a well that works anymore, even if you have a well, because you don't have an electric pump. And as soon as the gas is gone in your car, you don't have gas because nobody can pump gas, and there's no food, and we're done. And then you can think about what the ripple effects of that are in the United States military, because that means your planes aren't flying, nobody's moving, nobody's doing anything. So this is, there's been talk for a long time about the possibility of a cyber Pearl Harbor, right? I think this is exactly what you're talking about. And if you know your history about Pearl Harbor, you know that in advance of the air raid on Pearl Harbor, there was a U.S. destroyer escort, I think it was the Ward, off the mouth of Pearl Harbor that radioed in that it had detected in a Japanese midget sub trying to enter the harbor, and in fact shot at it. They reported they thought they sank it. So many, many years later, that midget sub actually was recovered off the bottom with a hole through the conning tower, proving that the skipper of the Ward knew exactly what the hell he was talking about. And then, in fact, he radioed in that warning to Pearl Harbor, to all the commands, hey, there's a Japanese midget sub here. Now, if you're military aficionado at all, you understand that a midget sub has to be carried almost directly to its target on a larger sub. They're these horrible little undersea coffin-sized things that can, move 3 miles an hour with limited range. Temperature inside is like 120 degrees. I mean, it's a good way to die. But anyway, as soon as you see a Japanese midget sub, first of all, there's a big sub here somewhere, real close. And I'm just going to guess that if the Japanese decided to go to war with us, they didn't send one sub to start this fight. If there's a sub here and they're putting midget subs in the harbor, maybe everybody ought to go to general quarters, sound the alarm, man the guns, put fighter planes up in the air. If they had paid attention to that alert, when the Japanese planes began to come in, we would have seen a completely different historical event occur. It got lost in the shuffle. It got put in a inbox. It was Sunday morning. Nobody woke anybody up, and the rest is history, right? Well, this is literally the same kind of moment. To add one final touch and piggyback on something that Frank touched on, I'm using this as an example of the immediacy of the threat. We're not just talking about the Chinese being strategic rivals who wish us ill. This ought to be setting off every alarm bell. This suggests immediacy of a threat. You will not take down the critical infrastructure of the United States and not think that you just started a war, right? Just like you won't send a midget sub into the harbor of Pearl Harbor and think that's the end of it. The only way any of this makes sense with the effort is in conjunction with near-term plans to really throw down, to use another technical term, right? None of this is occurring in isolation. You got a guy in the White House. As far as I can tell, the best information says minimum $31 million from guys directly tied to Chinese intelligence, guys whose job it was to do what used to be my job to do to the enemy. $31 million into this Biden enterprise. If you think that went to Hunter for his good looks, that's clearly not what that was about. So that's your guy sitting in the Oval Office. You can think about whether, if you were Xi, you would rather do this while he's there or contemplate the possibility of doing this when Donald Trump is back in the Oval Office. I would say the smart money is you're not waiting for the Donald to be back behind the desk, which would just further the concern. The bottom line being, as Frank has pointed out very effectively, we are not just talking about the Chinese are a strategic threat and we need to think about our policy. We're talking about really being at the point in time where we ought to seriously be considering the possibility these guys are getting ready to move. For instance, they're going to do this in conjunction with a move on Taiwan. Thank you very much.